But what a day we've had. I just want to comment on that. Again, Debbie, thank you for putting this together, and thank you to all our volunteers that made this happen today. It's been so exciting. So you're in for a very special treat. We are going to have a live podcast that's sponsored by the Cypher Brief, and we're going to talk about safeguarding elections. You may have noticed that we're having an election this year, and we're not the only ones. There's lots of elections going on across the world. And as we've talked about various times today, just the increase in misinformation and disinformation and cloning, fake videos, etc. How do we keep our elections honest and straightforward, etc., like we want them to be in the age that we're living in with all this bad information? So with that, let me first introduce Debbie Plunkett, who is a dear friend of mine. And she was a colleague who's an esteemed leader in cybersecurity for a long, long time. She's currently the principal of Plunkett Associates, the company she started. And she is a professor of cybersecurity at the University of Maryland. She sits on several boards, including CACI and Nationwide Insurance. And she is the founder and board member of Defending Digital Campaigns, which is a not-for-profit that focuses on helping to provide free or low-cost cybersecurity services to election campaigns. So thank you for that, Debbie. It was an honor every day to serve alongside Debbie at the National Security Agency, where she led the Information Assurance Organization, now the Cybersecurity Organization, and she also served at the White House. She's a true leader, in my opinion, with both character and competence, and we're thrilled to have her for this session. And along with her, Andy, not to leave you in the dust there, but we also have Andrew McCabe, who is a senior law enforcement analyst now for CNN, distinguished visiting professor at George Mason University, and he is the co-host of a podcast. Anybody listen to the podcast Jack? Anybody in here? So I'm highly recommending check this out. He has conversation on the ongoing special counsel investigation. It's very insightful. He is also the author, and I was talking to Andy a little bit about this right before we came in, of a New York Times best-selling book called The Threat, which this is a fascinating read about the courage that he demonstrated, others have demonstrated while they're serving in a public sector capacity at the discretion of leadership and others. So that book is fascinating also because he ran the counterterrorism section at the FBI during 9/11, I believe, and so he talks a lot. 9/11 was a game changer for all of us in the intelligence community, and he talks a lot about that experience for the FBI. So please, let me bring you onto stage and turn it over to you guys. And thank you very much for being here.
So, we've got an election coming up. Imagine that. And in fact, there's going to be a debate tonight. So, as I was trying to think about the best way to launch into this, I decided to go and look up headlines over the past 30 days-ish related to election and security. I'm going to read a couple of them to you real quick. From The Hill, why aren't we treating cybersecurity as an election issue? From Associated Press, California laws cracking down on election deepfakes by AI face legal challenges. From Axios, U.S. says Iran sent Biden camp stolen Trump info in election interference bid. From Reuters, Russia focusing on U.S. social media stars to covertly influence voters. From CBS News, U.S. accuses Russia of sprawling election interference campaign, seizes dozens of fake sites. And then finally, from Politico, 2024 election faces foreign interference efforts from Russia, Iran, and China. Who ever thunk? We've been talking, you did.
Yeah, I did.
10 years ago.
Okay, 10 years ago, maybe not, but.
Yeah, that we'd be sitting here today talking about elections, sort of the core of our democracy, and cybersecurity threats, but here we sit. So it's a great pleasure to be here with you. I'm honored.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
And so I thought maybe the best way we could kick off the discussion is if you could share with us, it's probably relative to go and take a look back. To maybe 2016-ish might be a good place to start, but you can start earlier if you like.
I don't know if there's anything good about 2016 for me,
I'll
go back to it.
I can imagine,
anyway.
Because what we're really talking about here is an effort that really started, certainly in that era, in the years before and after that, to both destroy the confidence of the U.S. citizens in the election systems that we depend on, and also to literally cause harm to them. So can you share with us your perspective of what was going on back then, and then we're going to make our way up to 2024 and talk about today.
Happy to. And before I do that, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here before the group. I'm sure there are 100 or more strong, smart women in this room alone who are more qualified to be here than me, so I'm a little bit scratching my head as to why I'm here, but happy to be here nonetheless. Okay, 2016 was really a watershed moment in this country when it comes to foreign hostile intelligence services attacking our electoral process. It has been going on for decades and mostly coming at us from Russia. There are all kinds of historical efforts that we could go back to that were efforts by the Russians to change the perceptions around candidates, but most importantly and most pervasively, to undermine citizens' confidence in their vote. And by doing so, to drive greater degrees of polarity, to pit Americans against Americans, and to undermine faith in the idea of democracy. Because a divided America, when Americans are fighting each other, and when Americans no longer believe in this experiment that we call democracy, Russia benefits. They are threatened by democracy, by the idea of it, and by its success in the West, and particularly in the United States. So it's been going on for cycle after cycle. 2016, things changed because they played a much more active role. They took what they had learned how to do in cyberspace, particularly through intelligence operations, and kind of targeted that machine at the election. And they did it in a couple of different ways, but the most significant was the establishment of the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, which was a company essentially in St. Petersburg, in which they recruited young people to help them distribute propaganda online. And they brought in trainers from across the globe. They taught them the basics of how to amplify, how to message on social media, and how to use each other's fake accounts to amplify those messages, to target them at the right audiences, and to really build support around these ideas. And they got into that very intensively, pushing messages that were on their face contradictory, pro-Black Lives Matter, anti-Clinton, and everything in the middle. And again, with that idea of threat of just tearing people apart. And that eventually changed subtly when they took a look, by they I mean Vladimir Putin, who makes the decisions on these operations personally. Confronting the candidates that they had to choose from, eventually Putin and the Kremlin determined that they were less favorable to Hillary Clinton winning the campaign, because she had been a problem for them as Secretary of State. She had been very tough on Putin and very hostile about basically the problems that Russia had been causing the United States and the rest of the world. So they were fundamentally anti-Clinton. And then shortly thereafter, they decided not only were they anti-Clinton, they were pro-Trump. Because they saw in candidate Donald Trump someone who they felt like they could establish a better relationship, a more productive relationship. They felt that Trump was a transactional person who they could deal with. And so that was really their three cascading goals. Overarching, undermine democracy. Second, let's try to damage the Clinton campaign. And third, let's try to advance that campaign towards Russia. So that's what they engaged in. They did it with the propaganda, and they also did it by stealing information, by breaking into the systems of different political organizations and think tanks, but most successfully with the Democratic National Committee. Into those systems they went, had unfettered access for quite some time. They stole a ton of information, and then they used that information, they used the media to weaponize that information at key points in the campaign. So that was a watershed moment for us in the intelligence community. Watching, understanding when they were in that network, seeing them taking reams and reams of internal committee documents and intelligence, that was not totally surprising because that's what intelligence agencies do. They steal information from each other. The Russians have been doing that in cyberspace for about a year and a half prior to when they showed up in the DNC system. Those are for intelligence purposes, to inform government leaders and influence decision making. But the difference here came on the eve of the Democratic Convention when they released that information in an effort to actually tip the scales, to start changing perceptions on the ground of the candidates.
Right, so then we rolled into 2020, and you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, 2020 was nearly as dynamic as 2016. We were better, and largely because of the great work done by CISA and our friends at DHS, and also my former colleagues at the Bureau. We were more dialed into the threat. We were more proactive about addressing it, and specifically in helping election infrastructure, which is diverse, obviously, and distributed around the country in ways that we could to support their systems. And there's a bit of a matter of how aggressively were the Russians in this space in 2020? We think less so, maybe because of the incredible attention and notoriety it got them after 2016, maybe for other reasons, but they seem to be less committed to one side or the other. So they were a little bit reduced from what they did in 2016. What we did see, though, was the follow-on actors like Iran. Iran jumped in 2020 pretty aggressively at not a very sophisticated level. They kind of followed the Russian playbook, but not very well. And you saw them using things like DDoS attacks and phishing attacks directed at the campaigns. Again, not particularly successful because of their low level of sophistication. And
I'd also shout out to private sector
yes.
during the same period, because it was around that time, between 16 and 20, that we really began to see significant investments by them in election security. I'm in the business of giving out free software to campaigns, and it's because of their generosity
right.
of seeding those activities that we are able to do that. Definitely. And so you have significant activities that have continued to date. I'd also say the states really began to step up their game. I mean, they own the election processes, and they began to significantly, and there were federal funds that were invested, never enough, but federal funds invested. Sure. And the states really began to take seriously their responsibilities there. It's
interesting, in 2016, they really pushed back on this idea that we were going to approach them in the way that we do on critical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And that many of the states were like, don't care, don't want to hear from you, don't need your help, go away. And then I think after 2016, attitudes shifted a bit. And then, of course, we did declare election, the national kind of election infrastructure as critical infrastructure. And so now the assistance from the government is pretty widespread and universally accepted. Yep. And I think that's raised the game a lot.
So then 2022 midterms came along, and they were pretty quiet.
Again,
from our perspective.
Quiet.
Again,
yes.
Quiet.
Yes.
And then August of 2024, what the heck?
Game on.
Game
We're
on,
back.
Big shock, right? At
yes.
least to me and those I work with, that early. Not that it happened so much and declared to be Iran, but that it happened so early. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's really a great example. I feel like definitely it's game on. They're all back, better, bigger, faster than ever. And I think we are too, right? It's less controversial now, this idea that the federal government, in the form of CISA and DHS and the FBI, with the help of their intelligence partners, are going to really lean in and try to be more proactive in protection than we were, quite frankly, in 2016. So that you're seeing, I think that's driving some of the early notice of these actions. But the Iran piece is interesting. What you're seeing from Iran this year is a much higher level of sophistication, right? We talked about the kind of basic phishing attacks from 2020. Well, now they're using targeted attacks, social engineering, and they're going with the bank shot approach, right? They're going after individuals who they think have access to people inside the campaigns. And they're targeting those individuals on the idea that they're easier to get to, they're less protected by institutions and institutional cybersecurity practices. And if you get into that network or get into that person's computer, you can use that to target the campaign itself through those trusted relationships. Classic intelligence officer operation, right? You always want a source, you want an insider with access. That's how you get to the target you're actually shooting at. And that's what they did. That's what was exposed in August. And I think the US is also being more proactive in embarking on that name and shame campaign where we indict people, we expose the intelligence, because there's an inoculation effect by doing that, right? People understand what we're doing and that these are real things that are happening. So that's Iran. Russia totally upped their game. No more IRA, no more Internet Research Agency. They need fewer people. They now have Americans, expats in Russia who are doing some of this work for them. And they have AI. And they have figured out how to use AI to create those false accounts, to write the messages and the postings and the social media posts and those sorts of things that they need to run this propaganda machine. They don't have to hire, train, feed, house people, none of that. You don't run the risk of having people turn on you and talk to the media. You just run it through your AI computer. So they're using far more, it seems, on some level, far more fake accounts, and they're able to direct them more easily. So they're still in it. And then, of course, we have China. And China's the lurking tiger, right? And the one that maybe in some ways, although today's events would put the brakes on this, but in some ways China might be the major adversary we are in some ways most likely of actually getting in a direct conflict with. And they seem to be sitting back, using maybe we know they've already spent a lot of time gaining positions in US critical infrastructure that they could use to their own advantage if in fact hostilities break out between the United States and China. So I think they're kind of keeping their powder dry for the moment.
So we are speaking of Iran, we are at a place in our world geopolitically that's really pretty tough, probably among the toughest that I can recall.
Yes.
With Iran attacking Israel today. So when you think about where we are as it relates to our geopolitical stance, do you think we're at any more risk from any of these actors, whether it be Russia, Ukraine, as a result of the Russia-Ukraine conflict or what's happening in the Middle East? Do you see them having an interest in our elections?
I think, provisionally, each one of those actors has a lot at stake in the outcome of this election, no question. Iran clearly has an axe to grind with former President Trump as a result of his the sanctions he imposed on Iran, pulling out of the nuclear agreement, which was a frustration for them, and of course, he was commander-in-chief during the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. So that is a debt that they still feel needs to be paid. So the Iranians definitely have an interest in the outcome of the election. You can assume that they are not favorable to a Trump administration, and maybe that is why they've spent so much time attacking the Trump campaign, stealing information, and trying to weaponize it by leaking it to the media. So we've seen that already. What happens as a result of the current hostilities in the Middle East is really the wild card. Yeah. America's support for Israel is certainly not going to make conditions between the US and Iran any friendlier. And at any moment, they could decide that going after the United States, particularly in cyberspace, where it's more easily deniable, is it could be an advantage to them in terms of their hostilities with Israel. That's kind of what we expected at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. And many of us spent a lot of time talking to our colleagues saying, it's time to stand up your defenses, really get ready for the threats from Russia. And from that, I mean not just the intelligence services like the SVR, not just the military intel services like the GRU, maybe the most active in the last 5 years, but from criminal actors who operate within Russia under the protection of, and sometimes at the direction of, Russian intelligence organizations. But then the war came and we didn't really see it. They trained their cyber attack capability on Ukraine, but not so much on the supply lines back here in the United States. I still think that's something that could change on a dime. And when Russia sees the right time to do that, if they feel like they need to take advantage of it, I'm confident they will.
So on a brighter note, there is...
Good news guy, here to wind you out for the day.
Yeah, misinformation, disinformation.
Yes.
There's some press reporting that talks about an increase in the number of deep fakes. You know, disrupting of the confidence of the American public in the systems, in the processes, in the counting, you name it, is certainly a part of the name of the game. Can you talk a little bit about that in the context of, you know, I know you don't, I'm sure you don't have a solution because you wouldn't be sitting here if you had a solution to it, but what your thoughts are around the impact of disinformation, misinformation, and you can really include AI in that because
it's
that's
a key
where
part.
It's a key part.
It's a key part.
That plays in,
You know, you're right about not having a solution. And I think solutions are a little tough to formulate right now, particularly under the old Section 230 rules, right? Section 230 is the part of the, I guess, originally Communications Act, 1934, Communications Decency Act of 96. It is the piece of the legislation that gives essentially protection to, somebody help me here, operators of an interoperable computer system, something like that. I forget how they phrase it. But essentially, internet service providers are protected from any sort of liability that results from the speech or the statements that third parties put on their platforms. And as long as they have that blanket liability protection, it's unlikely that we'll see meaningful regulation that would put them in a position to really go out there and police against disinformation and misinformation. Very sensitive issue here, obviously, because any effort that the government takes to do that work themselves is, you know, quite naturally perceived as potentially an offense on the First Amendment. So the government's not always in the best position to do that. But the private sector is reluctant to, essentially because they don't have to. So I think we're stuck with it for now. And my biggest concern is what you've noted, and it is that period that begins on election night and ends, you know, when the vote is certified on the 6th. And I think we've seen in 2020 that can be a very volatile and kind of highly charged time. All indications are it will be just as volatile, just as close, and probably just as highly charged in this cycle as it was then. And so in that moment, in a very divided country, when emotions are running high and the result is still kind of in suspension, I think people are particularly vulnerable to incendiary messages, whether they be from actual speakers or from fake ones. And so the idea of using particularly deep fakes, where you are creating a false message from a known person with an audience, with influence, be they a political figure or media figure, whoever that might be, I think that we are at risk of having a lot of people reacting to those messages without really thinking critically about whether they're true or not, and embarking upon actions that could lead to politically motivated violence. I think we're closer than we have been to a real outbreak of political violence in the last 100 years.
Yeah, that's pretty sobering. And you know, as we come close to an end of this discussion, we can't really talk about safeguarding elections without talking about the physical component of that. So our elections from, towns and hamlets and large cities across the nation are dependent upon volunteers.
Yes.
Who conduct the business of campaigns with diligence. It's their civic duty, very proud. And there are now reports emerging that, first of all, the number of volunteers is lower than usual, and that the volunteers are pretty scared. They're nervous.
Yeah.
How do we protect them so that they can actually conduct the business of voting in elections?
Well, I think it starts, at least, and this is something that we can all do, it starts with a message of gratitude and one that conveys how much we value the contribution of our fellow citizens. Many of whom are elderly, retirees, people who just care about the process. They all have their own individual political opinions, but they help us all execute our own in the form of the vote. And they need our support as much as they need government support or political leadership support. So I would ask you all to support them in any way that you can in your communities. I think the Attorney General has been very outspoken about his concern about this threat. He made a speech a couple of weeks ago that in this crazy time really didn't get a lot of attention, but I thought it was remarkable. It was really directed at his Justice Department, 150,000 employees that he's responsible for, and also those people working to put the elections on, and how he has dedicated massive resources in the department with the FBI and other agencies to address these threats. But we're always kind of a step behind, right? We can't get out and indict people or investigate them before they have taken action. In this way, we are somewhat stuck with being reactive in this sort of criminal activity, which is not good. But I think DOJ is trying to do the right thing. I think even more importantly, our state and local officials in protecting the polling places really have to step up their game this year. That's kind of the thing that causes me the most concern, because that's the part of the system that's least hardened. I don't think we're going to have another attack on the Capitol on January 6th. I really don't see that coming. I think we could prepare much better than we did the last time, and I'm confident they will. But there are many, many polling places around this country where Americans expect to be able to go in and vote in whatever way they wish, and to not be interfered with or victimized while doing that. And it takes a lot of resources and a lot of people to protect those places. So we've really got to stand up for our fellow citizens who are helping us all do this amazing thing every 4 years.
So last question.
Yes.
Crystal ball time. So what do you think we're, no.
Is that too soon? Sorry. Okay.
Where do you think we're going to be, though? What's going to happen here on July 4th, 5th, 6th, January 6th? Where will we, if you were a betting man?
I am not a betting man. If I were, I probably would bet poorly. Yeah. I think my record bears that out. It's really hard to predict, so I will make no predictions. I have learned from my new friends in media, don't ever make a prediction. But I will say that I think the reason it's so hard to predict is because it's so incredibly close. Yeah. I don't expect, and despite tonight's big debate, I don't expect anything to change those numbers as we get closer to Election Day. I think most people's opinions are pretty strong. This concept of undecided people at this point, maybe there are some undecideds here in the room, but boy, I don't know any undecideds in my life. But it's going to be close, and we're not going to know on election night. And that's just the fertile ground for conspiracy theories and misinformation and craziness online. Even though that's what happened last time, people forget that. And so that's going to be a very sensitive time for us, that period after the vote, before it's announced, which could be a week or so later, and then until it's certified. And if it's announced on a razor-thin margin, I think you just exponentially up the chances for kind of chaos and strong reactions. But we got through it the last time. And I actually believe that there are going to be, half the country basically is going to be disappointed. But I think you can't rule out sporadic issues of violent reactions and things like that, I think writ large, Americans will stand up, as they always have, and be Americans, and ultimately accept the results and march on, whether they're happy or sad. Could be a little rough getting to that point, but I think that's where it will be. That counts for optimism in my world. I don't know if it does in yours.
Well, I agree, and I would say that a win would be a free and fair election,
That's right.
regardless of
Yes.
party and winner. And those of us in cybersecurity really believe that,
Yes.
and many others do, that we want the elections to be fair, untouched, trusted,
Yes.
and we'd like the people who are involved in conducting them to be protected, and then that's a huge win.
Americans have more reason today than they have ever had in the past to trust and honor the results of the election.
Right.
What we do to protect the election is light years ahead of what it used to be. The technology is better. Everything is backed up with paper ballots now. It wasn't like that in 2016. It is now.
That's right.
We have the ability to certify and to recheck and recount and really determine with a laser focus exactly what happened. People should understand that, and hopefully that makes them feel more confident. So spread that word as much as you can.
Thank you so much for
Oh, thank you. It was a joy. Thank you.
Thank you all. All right. Good?
I think we've been dismissed.
I don't know. Somebody save us.
Yeah.